Toronto, 2010. A student left her campus library late at night. She boarded a streetcar at 10:03 p.m. That was the last confirmed sighting of her alive. For months, her family plastered the city with posters, begged for attention, and waited by the phone that never rang. Police combed transit logs and city cameras, but frames went missing and a witness saw nothing. A single scarf lay damp in the snow, its fabric fibers contested. For the Jensens, every night meant retracing steps, checking bus schedules, staring at an empty chair in their kitchen. Years later, a sealed evidence file was reopened, revealing an overlooked detail in a maintenance worker's notebook. That discovery exposed the predator behind the disappearance, and it explained why one ordinary keychain had vanished with her. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from today. And if you want more stories like this, don't forget to subscribe. The campus library emptied slowly that night, its lights still humming over rows of silent desks. Clara Jensen slid her books into a worn backpack, tugged the zipper until it caught. She pulled her scarf higher against the wind and walked across the quiet quad. A light dusting of snow had begun to settle, clinging to the lamps and branches. It was 10:03 p.m. when she reached the streetcar stop, just a block from the edge of Toronto's University District. A pair of students crossed behind her, laughing as they cut toward the dorms. Clara waited alone. Her brown leather keychain, clipped to her backpack zipper, tapped lightly against the fabric in the cold wind. The streetcar arrived with its usual screech of brakes. Inside, the lights looked harsh, metallic. Clara stepped up, her boots echoing on the steel steps. A camera near the driver's seat caught the motion, her figure blurred by the angle, the outline of the bag slung over her shoulder. It was the last confirmed record. The city rolled past as the streetcar rattled east. Buildings gave way to rows of shuttered shops, dark apartments, frozen sidewalks. Clara's phone sat silent in her pocket. She had promised her roommate, Marissa Lowe, that she would be back before midnight. When midnight came, the apartment remained dark. Marissa texted, then called. No reply. She thought of Clara's habits, the late-night study, the half-empty thermos of coffee, the keychain she flicked whenever nervous. It was unusual, but maybe she had stayed with a friend. By 2 a.m., unease pushed Marissa to call Clara's parents. Daniel and Ruth Jensen answered groggy but alert, listening as the details came out. Their daughter had left the library, boarded the streetcar, and then silence. Daniel drove through the city streets in the early morning hours, headlights cutting across icy intersections. He passed the stops where the streetcar would have let her out. No sign. At dawn, Ruth began phoning hospitals. None had admitted a young woman matching Clara's description. By 8 a.m., a missing persons report was filed. Police arrived at the Jensen apartment, notepad in hand, asking for the most recent photos. Daniel handed over one from her last birthday. The camera showed Clara smiling, holding up the brown leather keychain she had just unwrapped. Detective Alan Price walked through the timeline again. Library at 10 p.m., streetcar at 10:03 p.m., no records after. The driver, Henry Cole, insisted he didn't notice anything unusual. A routine night, another set of faces in the back. Posters were printed before noon. The Jensens taped them to bus shelters and cafe windows, their daughter's face staring back from 100 damp corners. Students walked the blocks near the stop, asking strangers if they had seen her. No one had. That night, the streetcar route felt different, empty, silent. The fluorescent lights seemed too bright, every seat marked by absence. The cameras mounted inside buzzed faintly, recording shadows, blurs, reflections. Later, when investigators pulled the tapes, they found Clara's figure once, just once, stepping inside. No exit frame, no trace of her leaving. The rest was darkness, gaps in coverage, angles pointing elsewhere. At the Jensen home, the kitchen table became a command post. A map of the city spread across the surface, pins marking transit stops and familiar routes. Daniel placed his palm flat against the paper, steadying himself, while Ruth folded another stack of posters. Marissa sat in silence, replaying the last conversation, Clara saying she would be home soon. By the third day, the winter storm rolled in. Snow drifted over sidewalks, covering footprints, masking evidence. The posters curled in the cold, their edges tearing loose from tape. Daniel checked every call, every whisper, every rumor. He pressed detectives for answers that would not come, but the streetcar still rattled on each night. Empty seats carried the memory of the missing student. The leather keychain, once so ordinary, became the object no one could stop picturing. It had swung once under the library lights, a gift, a charm. Now it was just another item logged on the missing persons list. Brown leather keychain. Last seen attached to backpack zipper. The frame of Clara stepping onto the streetcar remained. Blurred, grainy, cold. Her seat on the streetcar remained empty forever. Detective Alan Price retraced Clara Jensen's route with the precision of habit. He stood on the curb at 10 p.m., watching as the streetcar pulled to a stop. The driver that night, Henry Cole, wore a worn cap, his eyes flicking briefly to the detective's badge before settling back on the rails ahead. Nothing unusual, Cole repeated. He had said the same thing in his first statement. A quiet night. Students, workers, a woman carrying groceries. Then the girl with the scarf and the backpack. Cole swore she boarded, but he never saw her again. The interior cameras showed only fragments. Clara stepping inside at 10:03 p.m., blurred as she adjusted her scarf. Other passengers slid into seats, eyes on phones, heads down. Then the gaps began. Some cameras malfunctioned, others pointed away. By the time the streetcar rolled into the eastern blocks, the feed cut out entirely for nearly 7 minutes. Those missing minutes became the center of the search. At the Jensen home, the kitchen turned into a workshop. Ruth spread poster boards across the counter, smoothing wrinkles with her palms. She marked Clara's height, her last clothing, the description of her scarf. In the corner of each poster, Daniel glued a small picture of the leather keychain taken from Clara's birthday photos. "It will make her stand out," he said, voice flat. Neighbors passed through, picking up stacks to distribute. Some offered sympathy, others silence. The weight of the story pressed against the block. A student vanishing from a city streetcar with no exit, no goodbye. Detectives canvassed the stops along the route. Witnesses offered fragments. One man thought he saw Clara sitting near the middle, headphones in. Another swore she stepped off 2 stops early. Neither account held when pressed for details. The transit authority turned over logs of the streetcar's journey. Every stop, every break, every delay was recorded. At 10:15 p.m., the car paused near a dimly lit parkette. For 2 full minutes, the doors stood open. The driver couldn't recall why. The data gave no reason, and the CCTV for that stretch was missing. Reel replaced, file blank. The absence widened the silence. Daniel Jensen followed the route himself that evening. He walked from stop to stop, posters under his arm, scanning faces. At the parkette, he paused. Snow covered the benches, the swings half buried. The only light came from a flickering bulb. He taped a poster to the shelter wall, pressing until his knuckles whitened. Back at the apartment, Ruth cut out another photo of the keychain. She taped it above the kitchen table, beside Clara's smile. To her, it wasn't just a detail. It was the thing Clara touched every time she left the house, the sound she made unconsciously when nervous. A small, dull tap of leather against metal. Detectives moved methodically, but the family moved desperately. Rumors flooded in. Clara seen boarding another bus. Clara spotted near the lakeshore. Clara running away. Each one chipped at the fragile hope. Detective Price stared again at the blank stretch of footage. 7 minutes of absence, inside a moving streetcar. Passengers remembered nothing. The driver remembered nothing. And yet, in those minutes, Clara disappeared. The posters multiplied across the city. Cold wind tore their corners, leaving faces half ripped, staring out from glass shelters. A faint photograph of a keychain sat at the bottom corner, ignored by most passers-by. The missing footage cut off in the darkest stretch. The Jensen kitchen no longer smelled of coffee or toast. It smelled of ink, glue, and cold paper. Posters stacked in corners, maps spread across the table. Daniel Jensen leaned over the paper, marking another red pin into the city grid. Each pin traced Clara's routines: campus, the library, the cafes where she studied. Ruth clipped articles from the local paper, underlining passages. The headline spoke of missing student, of police searching transit. To her, they were already too distant, too formal. She added her own notes in the margins. 10:3 p.m., streetcar, Parquet stop, keychain detail. Marissa Lowe, Clara's roommate, sat at the far end of the table, flipping her phone endlessly. Every buzz jolted her. She replayed the last words exchanged. "I'll be home soon. Don't wait up." They were ordinary, too ordinary. Tips trickled in. A caller claimed to have seen Clara at a bar on Queen Street. Another insisted she boarded a different bus altogether. Police checked both. Nothing matched. Each false lead ended in another X across Daniel's map. The family began logging every call. Daniel built a ledger by hand, columns of times, numbers, locations mentioned. The keychain appeared in more than one description. Some claimed it dangled as she hurried down the street. Others said they remembered the brown leather charm against her backpack strap. The details blurred, but Daniel circled each mention, refusing to let it fade. By the fifth day, detectives revealed a small piece of data. Clara's phone had connected to a cell tower near a small park just east of the route. At 10:18 p.m., a single ping placed her within that block. After that, silence. Daniel drove to the park. Snow had gathered into drifts, covering benches and footpaths. He scraped at the ice with his boot, searching for any sign. The swings moved in the wind, creaking faintly. The park was empty, its stillness absolute. Back home, he placed a spare copy of Clara's keychain on the map, right over the park coordinates. The leather looked small against the wide spread of streets. He pressed it flat with his palm, as if anchoring his daughter's presence to the paper. Neighbors dropped by with casseroles, with promises of help. Mrs. Carr from next door lit a candle by her window each evening. Volunteers gathered to distribute more posters. Some returned with stories of people slamming doors, unwilling to hear another missing person plea. Marissa remembered Clara fiddling with the keychain during stressful weeks. She told the detectives how Clara spun it on her finger in silence, the leather worn smooth at the edges. Price noted it but said little. His eyes kept returning to the park, to the blank stretch of minutes on the streetcar tape. The Jensen living room shifted into a command center. The family pinned photographs, drew circles, mapped the transit line in thick marker. In the middle of it all, the spare keychain lay like a compass, pointing to a silence they could not break. On the third week, Daniel unfolded his ledger. Dozens of false leads, each one crossed out. The weight of unanswered calls dragged his pen. A single ping vanished into the winter air. Search teams gathered near the parquet as the winter deepened. Volunteers trudged through frozen grass, their boots crunching in the snow. The park was small, 2 benches, a swing set, a path cutting through to the next block. Yet it had become the focal point. The final cell phone ping, the inexplicable pause in the streetcar's journey, all converged here. Daniel and Ruth stood near the swings, watching as officers swept the ground with flashlights. The snow reflected the beams in pale streaks. A shout went up from the far corner, near the chain-link fence. A scarf lay crumpled in the snow, soaked through and stiffened by ice. Ruth recognized it immediately. "That's hers," her voice cracked in the cold air. The scarf was bagged quickly, tagged, and logged. It was pale blue with a faint embroidered edge. Clara had worn it every winter since high school. The sight of it pulled a sob from Ruth, her hands trembling against Daniel's arm. Forensic technicians later reported that fibers from the scarf contained traces of an unknown contaminant. But the lab results noted no direct confirmation that the fibers matched Clara's clothing from that night. The detail hung in limbo, suggestive, inconclusive. Detective Price examined the scarf under the fluorescent lights of the precinct. He marked the date, filed the chain of custody, and added the photograph to the caseboard. Still, he cautioned the family. Objects could mislead, could be planted, could belong to someone else. But the Jensens knew the scarf. Rumors spread quickly after the discovery. Neighbors whispered about a man seen loitering near the transit stop for weeks. He wore a dark coat, often stood alone at night, watching the passing cars. Some called him harmless, just a local drifter. Others muttered predator. His name surfaced, Peter Haldane, a transient known around the area. Officers questioned him briefly. Haldane denied knowing anything. His record showed minor offenses, nothing violent. Still, his presence near the stops unsettled the community. The whispers fed the city's unease. A missing girl, a scarf in the snow, a shadow at the curb. Back at the apartment, Marissa spoke quietly about Clara's habits. She remembered how Clara always adjusted her keychain when nervous, thumb pressing the leather until it bent. She said Clara had been anxious that week, distracted during study breaks, spinning the keychain in her hand like a coin. Daniel wrote it down on the evidence wall. Keychain habit, nervous gesture. He pinned a copy of the scarf photo beside it, lines connecting the items like threads of a map. The search resumed the next day, but no further evidence surfaced. The snow swallowed everything. Footprints blurred. Tire marks melted into slush. The park fell silent again, as if nothing had been found at all. That evening, Ruth placed Clara's spare keychain on the kitchen table. She stared at it in silence, fingers brushing the worn leather loop. It was the only thing that still carried Clara's touch. The scarf lay damp, no footprints leading away. By the second month, Clara's name was on every corner of Toronto news. Evening broadcasts led with images of her smile, her scarf, her student ID photograph. Reporters set up outside the Jensen home. Cameras trained on the porch as Daniel spoke in short, measured sentences. He asked for help, for vigilance, for anyone with information to come forward. Ruth stood beside him, clutching her coat, her face drained of sleep. The city began to listen. Posters appeared on subway walls, bulletin boards, even cafe counters. Clara's story spread beyond the campus, becoming a public question. How could someone vanish from a streetcar? Detectives fielded hundreds of tips. One stood out. A caller described a man in a dark coat trailing a young woman near the same streetcar line weeks before. The caller had dismissed it at the time, but now the memory seemed sharper. Police pulled additional CCTV from shops 2 blocks west of Clara's last confirmed sighting. On one tape, the reflection of a shop window caught something odd. Behind Clara, blurred by glass and motion, a tall figure walked a half-step behind. His coat was dark, his features indistinct, but the shape was there. Frame by frame, investigators watched the silent pursuit. When shown the footage, Daniel gripped the edge of the table. "That's him," he whispered, though the image gave no name. Ruth stared at the ghostly outline, the reflection more suggestion than proof. The press seized on the discovery. "Possible stalker," headlines read, accompanied by grainy stills of the blurred man. Talk shows speculated. Neighbors whispered about predators hiding in plain sight. Meanwhile, Clara's family pushed forward. They organized a vigil, candles flickering in the freezing wind. Students held photographs aloft, their voices shaking as they sang. At the front, Daniel slipped a hand into his pocket. Inside, the spare keychain rested like a stone. He rubbed the leather with his thumb until it warmed. Cameras caught the gesture. One photo of him standing beneath candlelight, hand curled around the unseen object, ran on the front page the next day. Detective Price noted how the community pressure shifted the investigation. Leads once dismissed were now reopened. Officers revisited the scarf, re-examined the cell ping, and interviewed anyone who had worked late along the route. At the vigil's end, Ruth placed a copy of the missing poster into the snow, the image half buried, the word vanished bold against the ice. The reflection followed her like a shadow no one named. Detective Alan Price stood in the evidence room, the hum of refrigeration units and faint smell of dust hanging in the air. On the board, the scarf pinned under glass was now joined by the blurred reflection from the CCTV still. Two artifacts, faint and incomplete, but they pointed toward one name that kept surfacing: Mark Duval. Duval was a maintenance worker for the Transit Authority. His file showed a history of disciplinary issues, nights spent on shift near the Eastern Line, a background littered with bar fights and restraining orders. Nothing had ever stuck hard enough to cost him his job, but the pattern spoke louder than any single charge. When investigators visited his flat, the room smelled of oil and damp concrete. He lived alone. A dented sedan sat parked in the back alley, its seats stained with years of grease. Fibers collected from the rear upholstery later returned with a note from the lab. Partial match to the fabric of Clara's scarf. Not a conclusive proof, but enough to raise the alarm. The Jensens learned of the discovery through a curt phone call. Daniel's hand trembled as he set the receiver down. Ruth leaned against the counter, whispering, "Then it's him." For the first time, their anger cut through the exhaustion. They drafted a public letter demanding transparency. They called for access to transit records, for the police to release more details. Reporters lined their porch again, microphones jutting forward. Daniel spoke carefully, his words chosen like stones. "We believe someone who worked along this route may know more than they have admitted." Inside, Ruth added Clara's spare keychain to the evidence wall. She hung it from a pin at the very center, so that every string of yarn, every photograph, every scribbled note radiated outward from it. A small leather charm became the anchor for their private investigation. Detective Price, bound by procedure, moved slower. He initiated surveillance on Duval, cars parked on side streets, officers taking notes from unmarked vans. For weeks, they watched him come and go, the monotony of routine carrying a menace beneath. Neighbors described him as quiet, brooding, unfriendly. Some remembered him drinking alone outside corner stores. One recalled seeing him near the streetcar stop the week Clara vanished, his face hidden in the collar of his coat. The fiber report gave the police leverage, but not yet a case. Still, within the Jensen household, the direction was clear. Every evening, Daniel sat at the table, drawing lines toward Duval's name. The keychain hung in the center, leather worn smooth by years of Clara's touch, now a relic in the dim kitchen light. On a cold evening, Ruth stood at the wall, her hand brushing the dangling charm. She whispered to no one, "Bring her home." The fibers whispered of hands she never knew. Surveillance became routine. Each morning, Mark Duval left his apartment in the same heavy coat, walking to the transit depot where he worked repair shifts. Officers logged his movements, noted his patterns. He drank at the same corner bar on Fridays, bought groceries at the same shop on Sundays. On paper, nothing linked him to Clara Jensen except rumor and a scarf fiber. Yet the silence around him felt heavier each week. Detective Alan Price knew the case could stall without more. The Jensens refused to let that happen. They hired Lewis Hart, a private investigator with a background in missing person work. Hart met them at the kitchen table, his notepad filling with addresses, times, and questions the police had not asked. Marissa sat quietly through the meeting, her eyes fixed on the keychain pinned at the center of the evidence wall. Hart noticed it, leaned closer. "That hers?" Daniel nodded. Hart sketched it into his notes, marking it like a compass. Hart canvassed the streetcar stops himself. He found a passenger who remembered a disturbance that night, something about a young woman being pulled toward the rear door as the car paused near the parquet. The memory was vague, muffled by time and cold, but it was enough to unsettle. Transit records revealed one more detail. On that night, a handful of riders used electronic passes. Every scan registered except one, a card swiped but never validated at the rear door. The system showed it as unconfirmed, an uncompleted transaction frozen in the log. Price stared at the report. The rear door. The same stretch where footage went missing. The same place where a scarf turned up in the snow. The gap narrowed into a single corridor. Daniel printed the transit log, pinning it beside the keychain on the wall. Ruth traced the lines with her finger, whispering the times like a prayer. Marissa shifted uneasily, remembering Clara's laugh as she pulled the keychain through her fingers. the sound like a muted chime. Duval remained silent under surveillance. He repaired tracks, drank beer, vanished into his apartment at night. Yet the unscanned ticket sat in the system like a frozen ghost, a mechanical trace of someone boarding or leaving without a record. For Hart, the clue was enough. "She never stepped off," he said quietly to the family. "She was taken." The unscanned ticket remained frozen in the system. The search moved beyond the parquet into the stretches of woodlands skirting the city's edge. Snow clung to branches, muffling the sound of boots as volunteers fanned out. The Jensens joined them, trudging through drifts with numb hands and red eyes. Every snapped twig sounded louder in the frozen silence. On the fourth afternoon, a volunteer called out. Beneath a tangle of brush, partly covered by snow, lay a torn backpack. Mud streaked the fabric. The zipper dangled open. A patch of leather hung loose at one corner, threads frayed where something had once been clipped. It was Clara's bag. Daniel dropped to his knees in the snow. His fingers hovered but did not touch. Ruth stepped closer, her breath catching, her hand clasped at her chest. Officers moved in, cordoning the area, lifting the bag carefully into evidence. They photographed every angle, every tear. Inside, they found only notebooks and pens, pages warped from damp. The side pocket held an empty thermos. But the keychain, the leather charm Clara carried everywhere, was missing. Torn clean from the zipper, forensic technicians marked faint impressions in the soil nearby. Tire tracks, distorted by thaw and refreeze, led toward the road. Dark stains dotted the snow, though tests later gave inconclusive results. The cold had erased too much. Detective Price studied the bag under sterile light back at the precinct. He traced the ripped threads, the absence of the keychain. The missing object told its own story. Someone had handled it, torn it free, taken it. At home, the Jensens sat at their kitchen table with the photographs. Ruth pressed her hand over the image of the torn bag, tears dropping onto the paper. Daniel pinned the photo to the evidence wall, directly beneath the spare keychain still hanging at the center. The contrast burned, one present, one missing. Marissa remembered watching Clara fuss with the bag before exams, spinning the keychain as she studied. Now that motion became unbearable to recall. The story reached the press within hours. "Backpack found," headlines declared. Crowds gathered at the search site, leaving flowers at the edge of the woods. The family stayed home, the silence pressing heavier than any crowd. Ruth touched the spare keychain once more, whispering her daughter's name. The bag lay empty, the keychain torn away. News of the backpack shifted everything. What had been rumor turned into focus, and what had been silence gained weight. Detectives reopened files on Mark Duval, combing through his work logs, timesheets, and prior complaints. His pattern surfaced: night shifts that coincided with Clara's classes, maintenance calls that kept him near her route, a history of loitering near transit stops long after his shift had ended. A deeper search brought forward other stories. One student, Emma Lee, remembered a man following her off a streetcar the year before. She had walked faster, clutching her bag, until she ducked into a late-night cafe. The man had stood outside, staring, before vanishing into the dark. She never filed a report, but the memory stuck. When shown photos, she hesitated, then pointed slowly to Duval's face. Detective Price reviewed a notebook seized during a warrant at Duval's apartment. The pages were filled with crude sketches of streetcar lines, stop names, and dates. Some routes matched Clara's weekly schedule. Others marked detours through quiet neighborhoods, as though mapping shadows. The Jensens received the news in fragments. Price sat in their living room. Evidence photos spread across the table. Daniel's jaw tightened as he scanned the notebook entries. Ruth covered her mouth when she saw Clara's campus stop circled in dark pen. The spare keychain still hung at the center of their wall. Daniel copied the notebook map onto their own, drawing new lines, marking dates. The small leather charm became surrounded by darker circles, as though the object were now trapped by ink the way Clara had been trapped by routine. Reporters dug into Duval's past. Former co-workers described his temper, his habit of staring too long at female passengers. None of it had ever gone to court, but each story added weight to the growing file. Emma Lee gave a statement, her voice steady but low. "It was him. I know it now. He followed her the way he followed me." The notebook lay on the evidence board under glass. The pages told no lies, only routes. His notebook traced routes she walked every night. The winter thaw came late that year. Ice melted into streams that carried debris into culverts, exposing what the snow had hidden. In early March, a group of hikers moving through the wooded fringe beyond the city stumbled upon something half buried in the thaw. A jacket sleeve, pale against the black soil. Police sealed the area within the hour. Beneath a shallow covering of leaves and dirt lay the remains of Clara Jensen. Her scarf, faded and torn, still clung to her neck. Her shoes were scuffed, one lace missing. The backpack found weeks earlier had been only the beginning. News reached the Jensens with a phone call they had dreaded and expected. Ruth collapsed against Daniel's chest, her voice a broken cry. Marissa sat rigid on the sofa, hands clutching her knees. The waiting had ended, but the silence was worse. At the coroner's office, the identification was swift. Dental records, DNA pulled from hair strands. There was no doubt. Clara had been found. The funeral came days later, under a gray sky that pressed down on the mourners. Students lined the steps of the church with candles, their wax dripping onto the cold stone. Professors attended, neighbors stood in silence. Reporters kept their distance. Daniel and Ruth sat in the front pew, their faces hollow. On the closed casket, they placed a framed photo. Clara smiling, the brown leather keychain visible on her backpack strap. It was the absence more than the presence that struck them. The bag had been torn, the keychain missing. Forensic reports noted soil traces consistent with a vehicle having been at the burial site. Faint oil residues marked the ground nearby. Investigators tied the findings back to the make of Duval's sedan. The evidence deepened, the circle tightening. At home, the evidence wall became a memorial. The spare keychain still hung at the center, but now beside it Ruth pinned the funeral program, its black border stark against the white wall. The city moved slower in those days. Candlelight vigils flickered across campus. Bouquets gathered at transit stops. Students carried their own keychains a little tighter, as if aware now of how fragile routines could be. The earth gave back what the streetcar had taken. The courtroom felt colder than the winter streets outside. Pale light filtered through high windows, illuminating rows of benches filled with reporters, students, and neighbors. At the front sat Mark Duval, his expression flat, his dark coat replaced by a standard prison uniform. His hands rested motionless on the table, shackled but steady. Prosecutor Margaret Hale rose first, her voice clear and clipped. She laid out the evidence in layers, each piece tied to the next. CCTV frames showing Clara boarding the streetcar, the unexplained gap in footage, the scarf recovered from snow, the backpack torn open, its zipper threads frayed, the unscanned transit log from the rear door, and the notebook seized from Duval's apartment, filled with circled stops that matched Clara's schedule. Then came the fibers. Technicians testified that samples from Duval's sedan bore partial matches to Clara's scarf. Another report tied soil samples from the burial site to residue found beneath his car. Each detail stacked against him, slow and methodical. The defense argued inconclusive science, chance overlap, coincidence. But the weight of patterns, of absence and presence, leaned the other way. The Jensens sat in the first row. Daniel stared at the photographs projected on the screen. The torn backpack, the frayed threads where the leather keychain had once hung. Ruth kept her hands folded, a small photo of Clara clasped tight inside her palm. When the prosecutor spoke of the keychain, the courtroom fell still. It had never been recovered. It was listed in the inventory as missing personal item. The absence became its own exhibit, an empty space logged by the court, a silence written in official ink. Reporters scribbled furiously, sketching the outline of the case in their notebooks. The word predator appeared in headlines the next day, tied to Duvall's face. Emma Lee testified with a steady voice. She told the jury how Duvall had followed her from a streetcar months earlier, how she had escaped into a cafe. Her story gave the evidence human shape, another pattern of pursuit. The jury watched, listened, noted. Each day ended with murmurs in the gallery. Each night with the Jensens returning to their quiet home, the keychain still hanging on the wall. On the 11th day, the prosecutor ended with a final image. The empty backpack displayed on an exhibit board, zipper threads unraveling, keychain gone. She pointed at the space where the leather charm had once hung. "This absence," she said, "is not coincidence. It is the mark of a hand that took her." The exhibit board showed an absence shaped like a keychain. The verdict came swiftly. After only 6 hours of deliberation, the jury filed back into the courtroom, their faces pale and unreadable. The foreman stood, voice firm, delivering the words that Daniel and Ruth Jensen had waited to hear for nearly a year. Guilty on all counts. Mark Duvall's expression never changed. He sat still, eyes fixed forward, as the judge pronounced the sentence. Life imprisonment with no possibility of parole. The gavel struck once, sharp and final. Gasps filled the gallery. Some wept, others simply exhaled, as though the weight pressing down on the city had shifted at last. Daniel gripped Ruth's hand tightly. For the first time, her eyes closed without fear of missing another call. Outside, cameras swarmed the courthouse steps. The Jensens walked slowly, heads lowered, surrounded by supporters. Reporters shouted questions about justice, closure, forgiveness. Daniel answered none. Ruth carried a small wooden box in her arms, pressed close to her chest. At home, they opened it at the kitchen table. Inside lay Clara's letters, photographs, a scarf corner, and the spare leather keychain. Ruth lifted it gently, the loop dangling, worn smooth by years of Clara's hand. She placed it on the table, beside the folded funeral program, and whispered her daughter's name. The case files closed in official archives. Exhibits were cataloged, evidence sealed. The keychain remained absent from the records, noted only as unrecovered personal item. Yet within the Jensen home, its presence endured. Not the missing one, but its twin, resting silently in a box of memories. Marissa visited often, bringing flowers, sharing stories of campus life. Each time, her eyes fell on the keychain resting on the table, a reminder of both the life lost and the persistence that had carried the case to its end. Neighbors lit candles one last time, lining the street outside the Jensen home. The flickering light reflected in the windows, casting shadows across the kitchen wall where the evidence board had once hung. The strings were gone, the papers taken down, but the outline of pins still marked the plaster. Justice had arrived, but silence remained. The keychain rested, but the lock remained unseen.